Good evening, dear listeners, and a very warm welcome to you all. Wherever you are tuning in from tonight, maybe cozied up in bed, listening from your favorite quiet corner at home, or perhaps relaxing somewhere peaceful with the world fading away outside, I'm so glad you've joined me here. Take a slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. Maybe pull the covers up a bit higher and feel the day gently slip away. Let the story begin. It was a misty November night in London when the fog wrapped the city like a shroud. I had not seen Holmes so energized in weeks. Then came the urgent knock at our door. Sir Reginald Ashcroft of the Foreign Office burst in, pale and trembling. At a grand dinner at the Savoy, a brilliant young archaeologist, Dr. Elias Hawthorne, collapsed and died in agony while examining a mysterious alabaster box containing ancient papyri. In the chaos of screams and spilled wine, the priceless box vanished without a trace. Scotland Yard called it a tragic accident. Holmes, however, saw murder. Within the hour, we were racing through the foggy streets toward a crime soaked in poison, greed, and secrets that could shake empires. The game was afoot. Chapter 1. A Case presents itself. It was a chill November evening in London, the year 1892. Thick fog wrapped the gas lamps in ghostly halos, turning every street into a realm of muffled sounds and blurred shadows. Coal smoke hung heavy in the damp air, mingling with the brackish scent of the distant Thames and the earthy smell of wet horses and carriage leather. Inside 221B Baker Street, our sitting room offered a warm refuge. The fire crackled brightly, casting golden light across the Persian rug and the scattered chemical apparatus on the table. The rich aroma of Holmes's shag tobacco still lingered from earlier that evening. I had not seen Holmes so energized in weeks. He paced restlessly before the hearth, his sharp eyes gleaming with anticipation, fingers occasionally steepled in thought. Mrs. Hudson had just cleared our simple dinner of roast beef and potatoes, the savory taste still warm on my tongue when the bell downstairs rang sharply through the quiet house. "A visitor in this weather," Holmes murmured, "and at such an hour. This promises to be no ordinary matter, Watson." Moments later, our landlady admitted a tall, distinguished gentleman in his late 40s. Sir Reginald Ashcroft of the Foreign Office entered, neath his overcoat glistening with mist and his boots caked in river mud. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he removed his damp gloves. The fine wool of his suit carried the faint outdoor chill into our warm room. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he began, voice cultured yet urgent, "I come on a matter of utmost gravity. This afternoon, at a private dinner hosted by the Egyptian Exploration Fund at the Savoy Hotel, Dr. Elias Hawthorne collapsed and died. A brilliant young archaeologist. It appeared as sudden apoplexy amid the meal, but I am convinced it was murder." Holmes gestured him to the fireside armchair. "Pray, sit and warm yourself, Sir Reginald. A whiskey?" Our guest accepted gratefully. As the firelight played across his features, he recounted the events. The dinner had featured spiced Eastern dishes and fine wines. Hawthorne had been examining a small alabaster box containing ancient papyri of immense value. Mid-speech, he clutched his throat, overturned his glass of port, and convulsed violently. By the time help reached him, he was dead. In the ensuing panic of shattering glass and frightened cries, the alabaster box vanished completely. "The papyri could hold secrets affecting modern diplomacy," Sir Reginald continued. "Foreign agents may be involved. Scotland Yard dismisses it as tainted food or natural causes, but I know better." The room felt colder despite the fire as the story unfolded. I could still imagine the scene. Silver clinking, laughter turning to screams, the crimson stain of spilled port blooming on white linen like blood. Holmes lit his pipe, the sweet tobacco scent curling upward. "Describe the table and the guests precisely." Sir Reginald listed them. Himself, Lord Harrington the collector, Madame Vespera the singer, Mr. Silas Crowe the rival archaeologist, young Theodore Lang the assistant, and others. Each had sat near the unfortunate scholar. Within the hour, we were rattling through the foggy streets in a hansom cab. The clip-clop of hooves and distant chime of Big Ben sounded ghostly through the mist. At the Savoy, the manager led us to the now empty private salon. The air still carried faint traces of roasted meats, spilled wine and candle wax. A dark port stain remained on the tablecloth, and broken glass crunched under our boots. Holmes moved with quiet intensity, kneeling to examine the carpet with his lens. "Observe these square indentations in the pile, Watson, and this indigo silk thread caught near the chair." I peered closely, but saw little of significance. The carpet felt thick and soft beneath my fingers, quite unlike the rougher textures outside. "It tells me the box was set down hastily during the chaos," Holmes said, rising. "The thief was no amateur. These marks and the thread suggest careful planning amid apparent panic. I confess I noticed nothing unusual in those faint impressions at first, though perhaps you, dear reader, were more observant than I, and caught the importance of that small indigo thread even then." Further inspection revealed a discarded glove with a faint alkaline chemical scent and a silver cufflink engraved with an ankh. Holmes's eyes narrowed with interest as he turned these items in the gaslight. "5 or 6 people had clear access to the table," he observed. "Opportunity, motive, and now physical traces. A man dead at a public feast, a priceless relic stolen, secrets that could sway empires. The game is truly afoot, Watson." As we stepped back into the misty night, the Thames lapping coldly below the embankment, I felt the familiar pull of mystery. The crimson threads of this affair had only begun to reveal themselves, drawing us deeper into London's shadowed streets. Chapter 2. Into London streets. The following morning broke grey and damp over London. A thin drizzle fell from a leaden sky, turning the streets into glistening black mirrors that reflected the pale gas lamps still burning in the early gloom. Inside 221B Baker Street, the fire burned cheerfully, filling the room with the warm scent of crackling oak and fresh toast. Holmes and I breakfasted quickly, the butter rich and salty on our tongues, while he reviewed his notes from the previous night. By 9 o'clock, we were out in the hansom cab, wheels splashing through puddles as we made our way to Mayfair. Lord Harrington received us in his opulent drawing-room. Heavy velvet curtains blocked the dreary daylight, and the air carried the rich aroma of his Cuban cigars and expensive leather bindings. The collector lounged in a silk dressing-gown, his face still flushed from the night before. "A dreadful business," he boomed, offering us seats near the fire. Hawthorne was brilliant but far too trusting with that alabaster box. I sat directly opposite him. When he collapsed, I was reaching for the port decanter. Chaos everywhere, screams breaking glass, ladies fainting. Holmes steepled his fingers. "And did you notice anyone near the box during the panic, my lord?" Harrington shrugged. "Hard to say. Everyone was moving at once. I did see young Lang hovering close, but the whole table was in uproar. I noted the heavy gold signet ring on his hand and the faint reddish mud on his boots, dried now, but still visible. The carpet underfoot was thick and soft, swallowing our footsteps completely. From Mayfair, we continued to the Alhambra Music Hall in Leicester Square. The theatre smelled of sawdust, stale beer, and grease paint, even in the daytime. Rehearsal sounds echoed across the stage, the thud of scenery being shifted and a flute being tuned in the wings. Madame Vespera met us in her cramped dressing-room, where the air was warmer and heavy with lavender perfume and powder. I sang the Lament of Isis," she said in her husky French accent, lighting a cigarette. Her sequined costume clicked softly as she moved. Dr. Hawthorne applauded most warmly. When he fell, I was only a few steps away, helping a waiter with a tray. Such horror in the middle of celebration. Her dark eyes flickered as she spoke. When Holmes asked about an indigo silk shawl, she claimed she had lent it to her understudy earlier that evening. The soft kid leather of her gloves looked expensive and well kept. Our third call took us to the modest Bloomsbury lodgings of Theodore Lang, Hawthorne's young assistant. The narrow staircase smelled of boiled cabbage and damp plaster. Lang himself appeared pale and shaken, his small sitting room cluttered with maps, pottery shards, and ink-stained papers whose rough texture caught the weekday light. "I prepared the box for display myself," he told us, voice trembling. "Dr. Hawthorne trusted only me with the cipher. If the papyri are lost, my entire career is ruined. I sat beside him at dinner, yes, but I swear I only wanted to protect his work." His fingers left faint ink smudges on the table as he spoke. The wooden floorboards creaked under our weight, cold and uneven. Consider the facts as we knew them then. The vanished alabaster box, the port-stained tablecloth, the indigo silk thread, the chemical scent on the discarded glove, and the differing accounts of each suspect. What would you conclude from these fragments? I set them down exactly as we gathered them. The reader may draw their own conclusions. By late afternoon, the drizzle had become steady rain. We made one final stop at a warehouse near the Thames, and where some of the fund's recent shipments had been stored. The air here was thick with the brackish stench of river mud at low tide, coal smoke, and wet rope. Crates loomed in the dim interior, their wooden surfaces rough and splintered. A foreman confirmed the box had arrived, sealed 2 days earlier. "Only Dr. Hawthorne's people handled it," he said, his boots scraping on the stone floor. Yet Holmes discovered a recently disturbed crate and fresh ink smudges on one of the manifests that matched the shade in Lang's rooms. As evening fell and fresh fog began rolling up from the river, we returned to Baker Street. The day's interviews had only multiplied the questions. Motives of jealousy, greed, and scholarly rivalry twisted together like the dark currents of the Thames itself. The crimson letter and its secrets still lay hidden, and the true hand behind Dr. Hawthorne's death remained disturbingly close. Chapter 3. Deeper Waters. We returned to the Savoy Hotel the following afternoon. A steady rain drummed against the windows, turning the embankment into a glistening ribbon of grey. The private salon had been cleaned, yet still carried faint traces of the tragedy. The sharp scent of spilled wine lingered beneath fresh polish, and the oak table felt cool and smooth beneath my fingertips. Outside, carriage wheels splashed through puddles with a constant wet rhythm. Holmes moved slowly around the table, his boots clicking softly on the parquet floor. He paused where Dr. Hawthorne had sat and knelt once more, magnifying lens in hand. "Observe this, Watson," he said quietly. "The carpet fibres here are still slightly crushed in a square pattern, exactly the size of the alabaster box. And here—" He plucked something delicate from the weave, another indigo silk thread, caught deep in the pile. I leaned closer. The thread felt fine and slippery between my fingers, quite different from ordinary wool. The air near the floor carried a faint herbal tang that I had missed the night before. Holmes rose, brushing dust from his knees. The box was not taken immediately. Someone set it down briefly during the panic, perhaps to transfer its contents or conceal it inside a larger garment. The poison was likely in the lining of the box itself, a resin activated by touch. Hawthorne handled it with bare hands while demonstrating the cipher. He held up the discarded gentleman's glove we had found earlier. Its leather was supple, but carried a distinct alkaline bite. When sniffed, "This residue matches the scent on the table's edge. Only someone with prior access could have prepared it." Sir Reginald, who had joined us, paced near the window. His face looked drawn in the grey light. "Then it was no foreign agent? This points to someone inside our circle?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. "The seating chart confirms it. Madame Vespera's shawl could easily conceal the box. Young Lang had unlimited access beforehand. Crow's sun-baked skin suggests recent travel, yet his boots tell another story. And this reminds me of the case of the Greek interpreter, where ancient scholarship masked modern betrayal and hidden documents. There, small inconsistencies in travel and ink stains revealed the truth long before the final confrontation. The mind that studies the past often forgets the dangers of the living. Yet I didn't understand then the full pattern forming before us, though I fancy some readers have already guessed at the connections hidden in these small physical traces. Complications arose when a hotel page brought a fresh telegram. Sir Reginald read it and paled visibly. Another inquiry from the German attaché this morning. They know the papyri are missing. If word spreads, this could become a diplomatic incident. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar intensity. Then we must move faster. The poison was subtle, absorbed through the skin rather than swallowed. The collapse was timed for maximum chaos. The thief counted on panic to cover the theft. We left the Savoy as the rain eased into a cold mist. The Thames flowed darkly beside us, its brackish smell rising with the tide. Carriage hooves clattered on wet stone. And distant factory whistles sounded mournfully across the water. Back in Baker Street that evening, the fire offered welcome warmth against the chill that had settled in my bones. The mystery, once a simple matter of theft and sudden death, was revealing deeper and darker waters. Motives of scholarly jealousy, financial desperation, and perhaps something more sinister were beginning to surface. Holmes sat with steepled fingers, staring into the flames, while I wondered how many threads still remained invisible to my eye. Chapter 4. Shadows and Suspicions. The next 2 days blurred into a relentless round of inquiries across London. The November rain had eased, but a cold, clinging mist remained, carrying the sharp scent of coal smoke and wet stone. Our first visit was to Lord Harrington's club in St. James's. The leather armchairs were deep and supple, the air thick with the rich aroma of cigars and aged brandy. Harrington received us with forced joviality, though his florid face showed strain. "I tell you again, I barely touched the box," he insisted, swirling his glass. I was reaching for the decanter when Hawthorne collapsed. The noise was deafening. Screams, breaking glass, chairs scraping. Holmes observed the faint reddish clay still clinging to the man's boots. "Yet you visited the Whitechapel foundries yesterday, my lord. Interesting detour for a collector of antiquities." Harrington blustered, but offered no clear answer. From there, we travelled to the Alhambra Music Hall. Once more. The backstage area smelled of grease paint, dust, and cheap perfume. Madame Vespera was rehearsing, her sequined gown glittering under the lights as her heels clicked sharply on the wooden stage. "The indigo shawl," she said, with a dismissive wave. "I lent it to my dresser that night. Many people touched it." Her voice was smooth, yet her gloved hands betrayed a slight tremor. We pressed her on her exact movements during the collapse. She claimed she had been helping a waiter, but a stagehand later whispered that she had been unusually close to Hawthorne's chair. The afternoon took us to the British Museum reading room. The air was cool and musty, with old parchment and leather bindings. Mr. Silas Crowe sat hunched over dusty volumes, his sun-leathered face tense. "I was at the far end of the table," he growled, "nursing a headache from the wine. Jealous of Hawthorne, of course, but poison him. Ridiculous." His boots, however, and still carried traces of the same reddish clay we had seen on Harrington. Tension mounted as the interviews continued. Young Theodore Lang met us in a quiet tea shop near Bloomsbury. The air smelled of fresh scones and strong Assam tea, but Lang's face was ashen. His fingers left faint ink smudges on the white tablecloth as he fidgeted. "I worship Dr. Hawthorne," he said quietly. "I prepared the box. Yes, but only to help him. Someone must have tampered with it after I left it on the table." 3 men had sat near the heart of the table. 3 had clear opportunity. 3 carried possible motives of greed, jealousy, or ambition. Which would you suspect most strongly, dear reader? I confess the evidence pointed in several directions at once, and I was quite lost in the tangle of half-truths and contradictions. Were you any clearer? A 6th suspect emerged that evening, Mr. Victor Kane, the theatre impresario backing Madame Vespera's show. We found him in a smoky gambling club near the river, the air heavy with cheap tobacco and spilled ale. The wooden tables were sticky under our hands, and the temperature felt oppressively warm. Kane laughed nervously when questioned. I wasn't even at the main table. I had a financial interest in the Egyptian artifacts, that's all, pure business. Yet a waiter from the Savoy later confirmed, seeing Kane slip into the salon shortly before the dinner began. False leads multiplied. One witness claimed to have seen a foreign-looking man near the hotel, but investigation proved it was only a confused tourist. Another suggested the poison was in the wine, yet chemical tests showed nothing. By the time we returned to Baker Street late that night, the fog had thickened again. The gas lamps glowed feebly, and the distant sound of a lonely violin drifted from somewhere in the slums. Holmes paced before our fire, the warmth doing little to ease the growing unease. The net of suspicion was closing, yet every thread seemed to lead in a different direction. The shadows around Dr. Hawthorne's death were deepening, and the truth felt more elusive than ever. Chapter 5. The Pursuit. The chase began on the 5th day with an urgent telegram delivered to Baker Street just after breakfast. The paper was still damp from the morning mist as Holmes read it aloud. A warehouse foreman near the Thames had spotted a man matching Theodore Lang's description, acting suspiciously around the Egyptian shipments. Within minutes, we were rattling through the streets in a hansom cab, the cold November wind whipping our faces and carrying the sharp scent of river mud and coal smoke. We arrived at the docks as a light rain began to fall. The air was thick with the brackish stench of low tide, tarred ropes and wet timber. Steam cranes groaned overhead, while stevedores shouted over the clang of chains and the hiss of escaping steam from moored barges. Holmes spotted Lang first, a slender figure slipping between towering stacks of crates, clutching a small bundle under his arm. "After him, Watson!" Holmes cried. We gave chase across the slippery cobblestones. My boots pounded heavily, splashing through icy puddles that soaked my trousers. Lang glanced back, his face pale with panic, and darted deeper into the maze of warehouses. And the temperature dropped sharply between the tall brick buildings, where cold shadows clung to the rough stone walls. Holmes moved with surprising speed, his coat flapping like dark wings. We cornered him near an abandoned loading dock. Lang stood panting, the bundle clutched tightly to his chest. The wooden planks beneath us creaked and felt dangerously slick from river spray. When he tried to run again, I seized his arm. The fabric of his coat was damp and coarse under my fingers. "Enough, Mr. Lang," Holmes said calmly, though his eyes gleamed with triumph. "The game is nearly over." Back inside the dimly lit warehouse, Holmes forced open the bundle. Inside lay the missing alabaster box, its smooth, carved surface, cool to the touch and still faintly scented with the same herbal resin we had detected at the Savoy. Several papyri were inside, though one appeared hastily copied in fresh ink. Holmes examined the box closely under a lantern's flickering light. "Observe the interior lining, Watson. A thin layer of resin, deadly when warmed by human touch. Lang applied it himself before the dinner, knowing Hawthorne would handle the artifact enthusiastically." Lang's face crumpled. "You can't prove anything," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Holmes continued naturally, piecing the evidence together as the rain drummed on the tin roof above. "You owed heavy gambling debts from the racecourses. The impresario Kane supplied the contacts, but you alone had unsupervised access to the box. The indigo thread came from Madame Vespera's shawl, which you used to conceal the artifact during the panic. The reddish clay on several suspects' boots came from this very warehouse district, not Egypt. This entire affair reminds me of the singular business at the copper beaches, where patient observation of small details, worn clothing, unusual ink, and nervous behavior exposed a far larger deception than anyone first suspected. The stakes rose sharply when Lang suddenly revealed that a foreign buyer was already waiting on a ship downriver. "They will kill me if I fail," he gasped. I admit my confusion had grown with every new revelation. The threads of evidence seemed to twist in so many directions at once. I wonder if you, dear reader, following this account carefully, had already begun to see the true pattern that still eluded me at that tense moment by the Thames. Holmes secured the box and signalled for the police. As we led Lang away through the cold mist rising from the river, the distant sound of foghorns echoed mournfully across the water. Resolution was approaching at last, yet the full darkness of the crime was only now beginning to emerge. Chapter 6. The Past Speaks. The following morning found us once more at Scotland Yard, where Inspector Lestrade had arranged access to certain confidential files. A cold draught moved through the dimly lit room, carrying the musty smell of old paper, ink, and polished wood. Outside, a light fog pressed against the windows, muffling the sounds of passing hansoms and street vendors calling their wares. Lestrade spread several documents across the scarred oak table. "Your instincts were right, Mr. Holmes. Theodore Lang is not the innocent assistant he pretended to be." Holmes scanned the papers with keen eyes while I looked over his shoulder. The records revealed that Lang had accumulated heavy gambling debts at several racecourses around London. His association with Mr. Victor Kane, the theatre impresario, went back more than a year. Kane had used his Egyptian-themed productions to launder money and move valuable artifacts through the criminal underworld. "The motive becomes painfully clear," Holmes said, leaning back in his chair. The wooden seat creaked under his weight. Lang saw the alabaster box and its papyri as his way out of ruin. He applied the resin days earlier, while preparing the artifact, knowing Hawthorne's enthusiastic nature would ensure he handled it directly at the dinner. I recalled Lang's ink-stained fingers and nervous manner in his Bloomsbury rooms. The pieces were beginning to connect with uncomfortable clarity. Further inquiries at a quiet public house near the docks brought more revelations. The air inside was thick with pipe smoke, sour ale, and the faint, brackish scent drifting from the Thames. A nervous informant confirmed that Silas Crowe had supplied Lang with the deadly resin through a chemist in Whitechapel. Crowe's sun-leathered face and false tales of recent travels from Cairo had been designed to throw suspicion elsewhere. The rivalry was real, the man whispered over his tankard, but the murder was purely financial. Lang planned to sell the original papyri to a private collector while presenting forged copies to the Exploration Fund. The signs were there from the beginning, though I did not fully see them at the time. The nervous way Lang hovered near the box, the matching ink smudges on the warehouse manifest, the convenient proximity of Madame Vespera's shawl during the chaos. In hindsight, they pointed clearly toward a carefully planned crime within the scholarly circle itself. That afternoon, we visited Sir Reginald Ashcroft at his office near Whitehall. The room smelled of leather-bound books, fresh coffee, and the faint metallic tang of government seals. Sir Reginald looked visibly relieved as Holmes laid out the growing evidence. "So it was not international intrigue after all?" he asked, his voice tinged with hope. "Not in the way you feared," Holmes replied. "Though foreign buyers were certainly waiting in the shadows. Lang and Kane intended to profit handsomely before disappearing. Hawthorne's death was merely the necessary first step." As we walked back through the bustling streets, the temperature had dropped sharply. A cold wind whipped between the buildings, carrying the distant clang of church bells and the rattle of carriage wheels on wet cobblestones. I pulled my coat tighter, reflecting on how ambition could corrupt even the world of scholarship and discovery. By evening, back in the warmth of our Baker Street sitting room, the fire crackled merrily, and the scent of Mrs. Hudson's fresh coffee filled the air. Holmes sat with steepled fingers staring into the flames. "The net is closing, Watson," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we shall bring them together and end this affair. The truth has been hiding in plain sight all along." I nodded, feeling the weight of the case settle upon me. The Crimson Letter and its deadly secret had claimed one life and nearly destroyed several others. Yet the final confrontation was now approaching, and with it the hope of justice for poor Dr. Hawthorne. Chapter 7. The Truth Emerges. The confrontation took place the following evening in a private salon at the Savoy Hotel, the same room where Dr. Hawthorne had met his tragic end. Gas lamps hissed softly overhead, bathing the long oak table in warm yellow light. The air carried the rich scent of fresh coffee and polished wood, though beneath it lingered a faint trace of the tragedy that had occurred there only days earlier. A cold draught from the river windows made the temperature uncomfortably cool near the glass. Sir Reginald Ashcroft, Lord Harrington, Madame Vespera, Silas Crowe, Victor Kane, and Theodore Lang were all present. Holmes had arranged the seating deliberately, placing Lang at the exact spot where Hawthorne had died. The young assistant's face was ashen, his hands trembling on the smooth tablecloth. Holmes stood at the head of the table, his tall figure casting a long shadow. "Ladies and gentlemen, the time for deception has ended," he began, his voice calm and measured. "Dr. Hawthorne was murdered for the alabaster box and its precious papyri. The killer sits among us tonight." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Madame Vespera clutched her shawl tighter, the indigo silk whispering softly against her dress. Silas Crowe shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the leather creaking. Holmes continued without raising his voice. "The poison was not in the food or wine. It was a rare resin applied to the interior lining of the alabaster box itself. When Dr. Hawthorne handled the artifact with bare hands and enthusiasm, as he was certain to do, the toxin was absorbed through his skin. The convulsions followed within minutes." He turned his sharp gaze on Theodore Lang. "You, Mr. Lang, had unsupervised access to the box for 2 full days before the dinner. You applied the resin while pretending to prepare it for display. Your gambling debts, carefully documented by Inspector Lestrade, provided the motive. Mr. Kane here supplied the underworld contacts and the buyer waiting on the river." Lang jumped to his feet, and his chair scraping loudly on the parquet floor. "This is outrageous. I love Dr. Hawthorne. I would never—" "Sit down," Holmes said quietly. "The evidence speaks clearly. The indigo thread caught in the carpet came from Madame Vespera's shawl, which you borrowed to conceal the box during the panic. The reddish clay on several pairs of boots, including yours and Mr. Crowe's, matches the soil near the warehouse where you hid the artifact after the theft. The fresh ink smudges on the forged manifest were made with the same ink found in your lodgings." I watched Lang's face drain of all colour. His hands left damp marks on the tablecloth. Holmes pressed on, his explanations flowing naturally as he walked slowly round the table. "You timed the collapse perfectly. The chaos allowed you to slip the box away while everyone's attention was on the dying man. Mr. Kane provided the carriage for your escape and the foreign buyer who would pay handsomely for the original papyri. The copied documents were meant to satisfy the exploration fund while you disappeared with the fortune." Victor Kane began to protest, but Holmes silenced him with a raised hand. "Your financial records show large recent debts and equally large expected payments. The impresario's Egyptian productions were the perfect cover for moving stolen artifacts." Silence fell heavily over the room. Only the distant sound of the Thames lapping against the embankment and the soft hiss of the gas lamps could be heard. Lang finally broke. He sank back into his chair, shoulders shaking. I never meant for him to die so quickly," he whispered. "The dose was supposed to make him ill, not kill him outright. I only wanted the box. The debts were crushing me. Kane promised everything would be taken care of." Sir Reginald let out a long breath. Lord Harrington stared in disbelief. Madame Vespera looked faint. Holmes nodded to the door where Inspector Lestrade and 2 constables waited. The handcuffs clicked coldly into place around Lang's wrists. Kane was also detained, his face twisted with anger and fear. As the prisoners were led away, Holmes turned to the remaining guests. "Justice, though late, has begun its work. Dr. Hawthorne's death was a cold, calculated act born of greed, not scholarly passion." I stood by the window, looking out at the Misty River. Holmes had seen the truth immediately, piecing together the small physical clues. The thread, the clay, the ink, and the residue that I had largely overlooked. I wonder how many of you, following this account with care, had already guessed the assistant's guilt long before this final gathering. The truth had emerged at last, dark and sobering, yet satisfying in its clarity. The crimson letter had claimed its victim, but its secrets would now serve scholarship rather than crime. Chapter 8. Justice. The arrest of Theodore Lang and Victor Kane sent ripples through London's scholarly and theatrical circles. The following morning, a police van rumbled away from the Savoy under a grey November sky, its wheels splashing through puddles with a wet, heavy sound. The air outside carried the sharp tang of river mist mixed with coal smoke from the many chimneys along the embankment. Inside the hotel, in the salon, felt strangely empty, now that the guilty men had been taken. Lang's confession came later that day at Scotland Yard. The room where he was questioned was cold and bare, the stone floor echoing every footstep, and the wooden table scarred from years of use. A single gas lamp hissed overhead, casting harsh shadows. The faint smell of carbolic disinfectant hung in the air, mixing with the nervous sweat on the prisoner's brow. "I never intended murder," Lang repeated, his voice hoarse. His hands, still marked with faint ink stains, trembled as he spoke. "The resin was supposed to make Hawthorne ill for a few days, long enough for me to switch the papyri and disappear. The dose was stronger than I realized. When he collapsed so violently, panic took over. I used Madame Vespera's shawl to hide the box and slipped away in the confusion." Inspector Lestrade leaned forward. "And Mr. Kane?" "He arranged the buyer, a private collector with foreign connections," Lang admitted. "The money would have cleared my gambling debts and given me a new life. Kane promised everything. I only had to deliver the original documents." Holmes listened quietly from the corner, his expression grave. The leather of his chair creaked softly as he shifted. "Your plan relied on the chaos of a public death. You counted on no one noticing the small details. The indigo thread, the clay on your boots, the fresh ink on the manifest." Lang nodded miserably. "I thought the fog and the crowd would hide everything." The criminal's response shifted from defiance to broken resignation as more evidence was presented. Yet the alabaster box was produced, its smooth carved surface still carrying the faint herbal scent of the deadly resin. The copied papyri, with their smudged ink, lay beside the originals. Each item was examined under the lamp's steady light. Their textures, cool stone, crisp paper, supple leather, telling their own silent story. Questions that had puzzled us were answered one by one. The reddish clay found on several suspects' boots had come from the warehouse district where Lang had hidden the box after the dinner. Silas Crowe had unknowingly provided the resin through a Whitechapel chemist, believing it was for a harmless scholarly experiment. Madame Vespera had been an unwitting participant, her shawl borrowed without her knowledge. Lord Harrington's brief visit to the foundries had been purely for business and unrelated to the crime. The impact on others unfolded over the next few days. Sir Reginald Ashcroft visited Baker Street to express his profound relief. In our warm sitting room, with the fire crackling and the comforting aroma of Mrs. Hudson's tea filling the air, he spoke with genuine gratitude. "The diplomatic shadows have lifted," he said, warming his hands by the flames. "The papyri will now be studied properly, and the Exploration Fund can continue its work without scandal. You have saved more than one reputation, Mr. Holmes." Lord Harrington sent a generous donation to the fund in Hawthorne's memory, his florid face showing sincere regret when we met him again at his club. The leather armchairs felt softer than ever, and the rich scent of his cigars seemed less oppressive now that suspicion had been lifted from him. Madame Vespera returned to the stage at the Alhambra, her performances now carrying a new poignancy. The theatre's sawdust and grease paint smells felt familiar and almost comforting when Holmes and I attended one evening. She sang The Lament of Isis, with particular feeling, dedicating it quietly to the memory of Dr. Hawthorne. Nothing in my long experience prepared me for the cold calculation behind Lang's crime. A young man of education and promise had turned scholarship into murder for the sake of gambling debts and a fleeting fortune. The consequences continued to unfold as the trial date was set, and the city's newspapers carried the story in careful detail. Yet, justice, though imperfect, had begun its slow work. Two men faced the full weight of the law, while the innocent walked free with their reputations restored. The Crimson Letter, once a tool of greed and death, would now contribute to knowledge rather than destruction. As Holmes and I returned to Baker Street through the misty streets that evening, the distant chime of Big Ben sounded across the fog. The case was moving toward its legal conclusion, and the shadows that had gathered around the Savoy dinner were finally beginning to lift. Chapter 9. Restoration. Several weeks had passed since the dramatic confrontation at the Savoy. The Old Bailey courtroom was solemn and cold on the morning of the trial. Heavy oak benches gleamed dully under the high windows, their surfaces smooth from years of use. The air carried the faint scent of wig powder, polished wood, and nervous tension. A low murmur filled the gallery as spectators settled, their woolen coats rustling softly. Ben Theodore Lang stood in the dock, pale and diminished. His once confident bearing had crumbled. When the judge pronounced sentence, penal servitude for life, a heavy gavel struck the block with a sharp, final thud that echoed through the chamber. Victor Kane received a shorter, but still severe term for his part in the conspiracy. Both men were led away in silence, their footsteps fading down the stone corridor. Outside the court, a thin December sun struggled through the clouds. The air tasted crisp and clean after the stuffy courtroom, though the ever-present coal smoke lingered in the background. Sir Reginald Ashcroft approached us on the steps, his face showing genuine relief. "The nightmare is over," he said, shaking Holmes's hand firmly. The leather of his gloves felt cool against my own. "The papyri have been returned to the Egyptian Exploration Fund. Scholars will now study them properly, without the shadow of crime hanging over the work." The innocent parties found their lives gradually restored. Lord Harrington organized a memorial lecture in Dr. Hawthorne's name at the British Museum. The reading room smelled once more of old parchment and leather bindings as distinguished guests gathered. Harrington spoke with surprising humility, acknowledging how close suspicion had come to tarnishing his own reputation. Silas Crowe, cleared of any direct involvement in the murder, returned to his archaeological work. We met him briefly near the museum steps, where the stone felt cold beneath our boots, and the winter wind carried the distant clang of church bells. "I was a fool to let jealousy blind me," he admitted gruffly. Hawthorne deserved better. I shall honor his memory by continuing honest excavations." Madame Vespera resumed her performances at the Alhambra with renewed grace. One evening, Holmes and I attended, the theatre warm, with the familiar scents of grease paint, sawdust, and perfume. Her voice rose pure and haunting during the Lament of Isis. After the show, she thanked us quietly in her dressing room, the soft click of sequins on her costume accompanying her words. "I was used without knowing," she said. "Now I sing with a lighter heart." Futures that had been darkened by suspicion began to brighten again. The Exploration Fund announced new expeditions to the Valley of the Kings, funded in part by donations that poured in after the case became public. Young researchers who had worked with Hawthorne found new opportunities, amid their careers no longer tainted by association with the crime. Normalcy slowly returned to Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps sounded cheerful on the stairs once more as she brought up trays of hot tea and buttered scones. The rich, comforting aroma filled our sitting room, where the fire crackled warmly against the December chill. Holmes resumed his chemical experiments, the faint scent of reagents mixing with his pipe tobacco. I returned to my medical practice, though my thoughts often drifted back to the misty November night when the case had first arrived. In quiet moments, I reflected on the entire affair. Ambition had twisted a promising scholar into a murderer, yet justice had prevailed through careful observation of small physical details: the indigo thread, the reddish clay, the ink smudges, the resin's faint herbal trace. The signs had been there from the beginning, subtle but unmistakable to a mind trained to see them. The city itself seemed to breathe easier. Fog still rolled up from the Thames on cold evenings, carrying its familiar brackish scent, but the shadows around the Savoy dinner had lifted. Order had been restored, reputations mended, and the pursuit of knowledge could continue untainted by greed and violence. As I sat by the fire one quiet afternoon, watching Holmes play a melancholy air on his violin, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The crimson letter had brought death and deception, but in the end, truth and justice had won the day. Chapter 10. Baker Street Reflections. A quiet evening had settled over Baker Street. The fire in our sitting room burned low and steady, casting a warm golden glow across the familiar clutter of books, chemical apparatus, and the old Persian rug. Outside, a gentle December fog pressed against the windows, softening the gas lamps into hazy halos. The air inside carried the comforting scents of Holmes's shag tobacco, fresh coffee from Mrs. Hudson's tray, and the faint, woody aroma of burning oak logs. I sat in my usual armchair with a glass of brandy, its smooth warmth spreading pleasantly through me. Holmes lounged opposite, legs stretched toward the fire, his long fingers holding his pipe. The violin lay silent on the table for once, and the only sounds were the soft crackle of the flames and the distant, muffled rumble of a late, hansom cab passing below. "The papers this morning carried the final report on the trial," I remarked, setting down the newspaper. The crisp pages rustled under my fingers. "Lang and Kane have begun their sentences. The Exploration Fund has already announced new expeditions using the recovered papyri." Holmes nodded, drawing slowly on his pipe. The sweet tobacco smoke curled upward in lazy spirals. "A satisfactory conclusion, Watson. Greed turned scholarship into murder, but the truth emerged from the smallest traces: the indigo thread, the warehouse clay, the ink, the resin. Physical evidence never lies, even when men do." We spoke at length about the case. The brandy glasses catching the firelight, Holmes recounted how the square impressions in the carpet and the faint alkaline scent on the glove had first caught his attention. I listened, marveling again at how the pieces had fitted together so neatly once the key observations were made. "The past always speaks if one listens carefully," Holmes said. Hawthorne's enthusiasm with the artifact was predictable. Lang counted on that predictability. What he failed to account for was that the city itself, its mud, its threads, its ink, it would bear witness against him. I reflected on the broader lessons. A promising young man had thrown away his future for gambling debts and a quick fortune. An innocent scholar had died amid fine wine and scholarly conversation. Reputations had been tested and, for the most part, restored. The crimson letter, once a tool of death and deception, would now enrich historical knowledge rather than destroy lives. To those who have followed this account through its many twists and turns, I find myself writing now. I offer this final thought: the truth often lies, not in grand conspiracies or locked rooms, but in the quiet, overlooked details of everyday life. The mud on a boot, the thread on a carpet, the tremor in a voice. These are the voices of justice, if one has the patience to hear them. Holmes rose and walked to the window, looking out into the foggy night. The temperature in the room felt pleasantly warm against the chill pressing from outside. "Another case closed, Watson. London continues its restless life, full of new mysteries waiting to reveal themselves." I joined him briefly at the window. The street below was quiet, the fog turning every lamp into a soft beacon. The distant sound of a night watchman's call drifted up, faint and reassuring. We returned to our chairs, the fire now reduced to glowing embers. Holmes picked up his violin and began to play a gentle, reflective melody. The notes rose and fell softly, filling the room with their warmth. I closed my eyes, letting the music wash over me, grateful for the quiet satisfaction that comes when order is restored and justice served. The case of the Crimson Letter had begun on a misty November night and ended in this peaceful December evening. Lives had been lost, and lives had been saved. Ambition had been exposed, and scholarship had been allowed to continue its honest path. As the violin's final notes faded into the comfortable silence of our rooms, I felt a deep contentment. Baker Street was at peace once more. And so, for the moment, was I.